Isabella Romano had been inside Dante Moretti's mansion for less than 3 minutes, and she already knew she'd made a terrible mistake by coming here. Before we begin, if you're watching right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Don't forget to like this video and turn on your notifications, because the stories here are meant to be felt, not just heard. Let's begin. The moment his driver had opened the car door outside those iron gates that looked more like a fortress than a home, every instinct she had screamed at her to run. But running wasn't an option anymore. It hadn't been an option since her father signed those papers 2 weeks ago, papers that dissolved the Romano family's independence and folded everything they had, every business, every asset, every debt, into the Moretti empire, including her. Now she stood in the center of a marble foyer so vast it could swallow her childhood home whole, her reflection fracturing across polished floors that probably cost more than her college education. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen waterfalls, casting warm golden light that should have felt welcoming, but instead felt like standing on stage under a spotlight. Exposed. Evaluated. She smoothed her hands down the silk of her evening gown, champagne-colored, elegant, chosen specifically because her mother said it made her look appropriate for a man like him. Whatever that meant. Isabella hadn't wanted to know. She still didn't. But she was about to find out. "Miss Romano." The voice came from behind her, low and dark as smoke, and Isabella's entire body went still. She'd heard that voice before. Once. 3 weeks ago in her father's study, muffled through heavy oak doors while she'd stood in the hallway with her ear pressed to the wood, trying to understand why her father looked so afraid. That voice had been calm then, almost pleasant, while it explained exactly how the Romano family's gambling debts and failed shipments had created a problem that required resolution. Her father had called it a merger. Dante Moretti had called it an acquisition. Isabella called it exactly what it was: surrender. She turned slowly, deliberately, refusing to let him see her fear. And immediately regretted it. Dante Moretti stood 10 feet away in the arched entrance to what looked like a study, and he was somehow worse than she'd imagined. Not worse looking, God, no, that would have made this easier. He was worse because he was exactly the kind of devastating that made smart women stupid. Tall, easily 6'3", with the build of a man who knew violence intimately. His black suit was tailored so precisely it looked painted on, the kind of craftsmanship that whispered Italian and expensive in the same breath. Dark hair, perfectly styled. A jaw that could cut glass. And eyes, those eyes, cold and calculating as a shark's, fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He looked at her the way men looked at things they owned. "Mr. Moretti." She was proud of how steady her voice came out. "Dante," he corrected, moving toward her with the fluid grace of a predator. "We're engaged, after all. Formality seems unnecessary." Engaged. The word sat bitter on her tongue. They'd never even spoken before tonight. Is that what we're calling this? Isabella lifted her chin, meeting his gaze even though her heart hammered against her ribs. An engagement? Something flickered in those cold eyes. Amusement, maybe. Or approval. What would you prefer to call it? He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Close enough to be possessive without actually touching her. Yet, honestly, she didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction. A hostage situation. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. Then he laughed, a low, dark sound that vibrated through her chest. His hand settled on the small of her back, warm through the thin silk of her gown, proprietary and deliberate. "You're more honest than your father." His breath ghosted against her ear. "I appreciate that." Isabella forced herself not to flinch away from his touch, even though every nerve in her body screamed at the contact. This was a test. Everything with men like him was a test. "My father's an excellent liar," she said quietly. He's had a lot of practice. Yes. Dante's thumb traced a slow circle against her spine, a gesture that should have been comforting but felt like a brand. Lying to me about his debts. Lying to the Santoro family about shipment routes. Lying to his daughter about how bad things really were. She stiffened. He told me enough. Did he? His hand slid up her back, settling between her shoulder blades, gentle but unmistakably controlling. Steering her. Did he tell you that without this arrangement, the Santoros would have skinned him alive and dumped his body in the harbor? Did he mention that 3 other families were circling, waiting to carve up the Romano territory like a Christmas turkey? Isabella's stomach twisted. No. Her father had told her the business was struggling. That this marriage would stabilize things. That Dante Moretti was powerful but reasonable. He'd made it sound like a choice. He told me, she said through clenched teeth, that you needed a wife to improve your image. That you wanted someone from a respected family to make you look legitimate. True. Dante's hand finally left her back as he moved to stand in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. The chandelier light cast shadows across his face, making him look carved from marble. Beautiful and merciless. I do need a wife. The kind of wife who can stand beside me at charity galas and political fundraisers without flinching. Who can smile at senators and make my enemies believe I'm becoming respectable. He stepped closer. But I didn't need you specifically, Isabella. Her breath caught. Then why? Because you walked into your father's study 3 weeks ago and asked him point-blank if he'd sold you to save himself. His eyes held hers, and she saw something there that terrified her more than his reputation ever could. Recognition. And when he lied to your face, you didn't cry. You didn't scream. You stood there and took it, because you knew the truth already and you were calculating how to survive it. Isabella's throat went tight. She'd thought she was alone when she'd confronted her father. Thought no one had heard that conversation. You had someone listening, she whispered. I have people everywhere. It wasn't a boast. Just fact. And the moment I heard you ask that question, no hysteria, no denial, just cold assessment of your situation, I knew you were exactly what I needed. A doormat? Bitterness leaked into her voice. Someone who'll just accept being traded like livestock. No. His hand came up and she thought he might touch her face, but he didn't. His fingers hovered near her jaw, close enough to feel but not make contact. The restraint somehow more intense than if he'd actually touched her. Someone smart enough to understand that survival requires adaptation. Someone strong enough to hate this arrangement, but strategic enough to make it work anyway. His eyes dropped to her mouth. Someone who won't break easily. The air between them felt electric, charged with something Isabella didn't want to name. This was wrong. He was wrong, a criminal, a killer, the kind of man her mother had warned her about in whispered conversations behind closed doors. But God help her, she understood exactly what he meant. And some traitorous part of her, the part that had spent her whole life watching her father make weak choices and stupid mistakes, wondered what it would be like to stand beside someone who never did. I won't love you, she said softly, because she needed him to understand at least that much. Dante's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Good. His hand finally made contact, fingers curling gently beneath her chin, tilting her face up toward his. Love makes people vulnerable. Weak. I don't need you to love me, Isabella. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice dropping to a dark whisper that slid down her spine like warm honey. I just need you to belong to me. Then he stepped back, releasing her so abruptly she almost stumbled. Your room is upstairs, second door on the left. Your things have already been moved in. He straightened his cuffs, his expression shifting back to that cold, controlled mask. Business. We have a dinner tomorrow night with the mayor and his wife. Wear something red. Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. That's it? That's all you have to say? For tonight. He turned toward the study, pausing in the doorway. Oh, and Isabella? She waited, hating how breathless she sounded. Yes. His eyes found hers across the foyer, and in them she saw the truth. This wasn't a negotiation. It never had been. Welcome home. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Isabella alone in the golden light of her new prison, her heart racing and her mind already planning how to survive a man who collected people the way other men collected art. Beautiful, valuable, and completely, utterly his. The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante's study like a blade, illuminating the maps and documents spread across his mahogany desk. Isabella stood near the doorway, watching him work. 3 days had passed since he'd brought her to this fortress of marble and steel, and she was still learning the rhythm of his world. The silent guards, the encrypted phone calls, the way danger lurked beneath every beautiful surface. She'd barely slept in the guest suite he'd assigned her, hyper-aware that somewhere in this mansion, the man she was supposed to marry was making decisions that would bind their families together. Decisions about territory, about power, about her. Dante didn't look up from the satellite images he was studying, but his voice carried across the room with quiet authority. You don't have to stand in the doorway like a ghost, Isabella. If you have something to say, say it. She stepped inside, her silk robe whispering against her skin. I want to understand what happens next. With the merger. With us. That made him pause. He lifted his gaze slowly, those storm-gray eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the morning light, he looked almost civilized. White shirt rolled to his elbows, dark hair slightly disheveled. But Isabella had learned that Dante Moretti was most dangerous when he appeared relaxed. What do you want to happen? He asked, setting down the photograph he'd been examining. Before she could answer, Marco appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture tense. Isabella had learned to read Dante's second-in-command over the past few days. When Marco looked like that, something was wrong. Boss, we have a situation at the East Gate. Dante's entire demeanor shifted. The man disappeared. The Mafia boss emerged. What kind of situation? A woman. She's asking for you specifically. Says her name is Giuliana Rossi. The name hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Isabella watched Dante's face transform, not with anger, but with something far more disturbing. Shock. Recognition. And beneath it all, something that looked like barely contained devastation. That's not possible, Dante said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual command. Giuliana is dead. Marco's jaw tightened. She's at the gate right now. With 2 infant car seats. The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabella felt something cold settle in her chest. She didn't know who Giuliana Rossi was, but the way Dante's hand had gone still on the desk, the way every line of his body had gone rigid, this woman meant something. Something that made a man who controlled half the city's underworld look like he'd seen a ghost. Show me, Dante said finally, his voice hollow. Marco pulled out a tablet, swiping to the security feed from the East Gate. The screen filled with an image that made Isabella's blood run cold. A woman stood in the harsh morning sun, looking exhausted and terrified but determined. Her dark hair was pulled back messily, her clothes simple and worn. So different from the designer elegance that filled Dante's world. She held herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd been running for a long time and had finally stopped. At her feet were 2 infant car seats, pink blankets visible inside them. Isabella watched Dante stare at the screen, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw his carefully constructed control fracture. How long has she been out there? His voice was barely above a whisper. 15 minutes. She won't leave. She says she'll wait as long as it takes. Dante set the tablet down slowly, like it might shatter. Then he turned to the window, his back to both of them, shoulders rigid with tension Isabella could feel from across the room. Leave us, he said to Marco. Boss! Now! Marco left without another word, but not before shooting Isabella a look she couldn't quite interpret. Warning? Sympathy? The silence stretched until Isabella couldn't bear it anymore. Who is she? Dante's reflection in the window was unreadable. Someone who shouldn't exist. That's not an answer. He turned then, and Isabella had to fight not to step back from the darkness in his eyes. This wasn't the calculating boss who'd negotiated her family's surrender. This was something raw and dangerous. Giuliana Rossi was someone I knew 3 years ago. Before I became this. He gestured vaguely at the office, the mansion, the empire. She disappeared during a raid on one of my father's warehouses. I watched the building burn. I searched for weeks. There was blood, her blood, and no body, but no one survives that kind of fire. Isabella's throat tightened. And now she's at your gate with babies. Twins, apparently. The implication hung between them like a loaded gun. Dante. Don't. His voice cracked like a whip. Don't ask me questions I can't answer yet. But Isabella hadn't survived in her father's house by staying silent when it mattered. She moved closer, close enough to see the war raging behind his eyes. If those children are yours, everything changes. I'm aware. Our engagement is a contract that binds our families regardless of my personal complications. The words were harsh, but his eyes told a different story. Conflict. Guilt. Something that might have been grief. Isabella felt something twist inside her chest, not quite jealousy, not quite anger. Something more complicated. She'd known their engagement was strategic, that whatever was building between them in the quiet moments was dangerous and probably doomed. But seeing proof of his past, of a woman he'd cared about enough to search burning buildings for. You loved her, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Dante's jaw clenched. I was 23 and stupid enough to think love could exist in this world. She taught me otherwise when she chose to work with my enemies. Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Because I have. He moved to the desk, bracing his hands on the surface like he needed the support. Giuliana didn't just disappear, Isabella. The night of that fire, I received a message from the Calabrese family, my father's rivals. They sent me a video of her selling information about our shipment routes, our safe houses, our family's movements. She was the reason my father walked into that ambush. The reason he died. The words landed like physical blows. After the fire, I hoped it was justice. That she'd died trying to escape the consequences of her betrayal. I mourned her and hated her in equal measure. His voice dropped to something barely audible. And now she's at my gate with babies she claims are mine. Isabella understood then, the true horror of this moment. If Giuliana had been pregnant when she disappeared, if she'd been carrying his children while working with his enemies. You think it's a trap. Everything in my world is a trap. He straightened, and Isabella watched him rebuild his armor piece by piece, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the boss's cold control. But I need to know. He was already moving toward the door when Isabella spoke. What do you want me to do? Dante stopped, turning to look at her with an expression she couldn't read. Stay in the house. Don't come downstairs. Whatever this is, it doesn't concern you yet. But they both knew that was a lie. Isabella watched him leave, heard his footsteps echo through the marble halls, and then moved to the window that overlooked the east gate. From this height, she could just make out the scene below. Dante walking across the courtyard with Marco and 4 guards flanking him, his posture radiating lethal control. And at the gate, a woman holding onto the iron bars, her face tilted up toward the mansion with an expression of desperate hope that made Isabella's chest ache. She watched Dante stop 3 feet from the gate. Watched Giuliana say something that made his entire body go still. Watched the woman gesture to the car seats. And then, Dante's hand shot out, gripping the iron bars, so hard Isabella could see his knuckles go white even from this distance. One of the babies had started crying. And Dante Moretti, the man who'd conquered half the city without flinching, looked like he was about to shatter. Isabella pressed her hand against the cold glass, a sick feeling spreading through her stomach. Because she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that whatever fragile beginning had existed between her and Dante had just been demolished by the past he thought he'd buried. Below, she watched Dante give an order. The gates began to open, and Isabella knew, with the certainty of someone who'd grown up in this world of blood and betrayal, that nothing would ever be the same. Isabella hadn't slept in 2 days. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Dante's penthouse, watching the city lights blur through the rain that streaked down the glass. Behind her, the vast living room was silent except for the distant hum of voices, Dante's men, always present now, always watching. Always armed. Everything had changed the moment Juliana walked through those gates. Isabella pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window. She should leave, pack her things, call her mother, disappear back into the life she'd been pulled from 2 months ago when her father signed her over to Dante Moretti like a business asset. But she couldn't, not because of the engagement, not because of the merger that saved her family's failing empire, because somewhere between the forced dinners and the careful distance Dante kept, something had shifted. She'd started watching for him in doorways, started noticing the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking, started feeling something dangerous bloom in her chest every time his dark eyes found hers across a room. And now there were twins, babies who looked exactly like him, and a woman who'd loved him first. You should eat something. Isabella didn't turn around. She'd learned to recognize Dante's footsteps, measured, controlled, the walk of a man who owned everything he touched. "I'm not hungry," she said quietly. She heard him move closer, felt the heat of him behind her even though he didn't touch her. He never did. Not unless it was for show in public, his hand possessive on her lower back while cameras flashed and rivals watched. "You've been standing here for an hour," Dante said, his voice low, that slight Italian accent wrapping around the words in a way that made her skin prickle. "My men are starting to think you're planning to jump. Would you care if I did?" The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. "Yes," he said finally. "I would." Isabella closed her eyes. She hated that his answer mattered, hated that she'd been searching for proof that she was more than a transaction to him. "She's still here," Isabella said instead. "In the guest house. With your children. I'm aware. Are you?" She turned to face him now, and immediately regretted it. Dante Moretti was devastating in a suit, all sharp edges and controlled power. But here, in the dim light of his penthouse at 2 a.m, wearing just dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly disheveled, he was dangerous in an entirely different way. "I'm aware of everything that happens in my home, Isabella." "Then you know she hasn't stopped crying." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You know those babies wake up every 2 hours. You know she's terrified." "Yes," Dante said simply. "I know. And you're just going to let her stay here? After what she did? After she what?" Dante stepped closer, and Isabella's back hit the cold window. "Tell me, Cara, what do you think she did?" Isabella's pulse jumped. She lifted her chin, refusing to back down even though every instinct screamed at her to put distance between them. "She left you. Disappeared. And now she's back with children she claims are yours." "They are mine." The certainty in his voice stole her breath. "How can you be sure?" "Because I see myself in them every time I look at their faces." Something flickered in Dante's expression, dark and pained. "Because I know exactly when they were conceived. Because Juliana has never lied to me about anything that mattered." Isabella felt something crack inside her chest. "Then why did she leave?" "That," Dante said softly, "is what I intend to find out." He reached past her, and for one electrifying moment, she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his hand pressed against the window beside her head, caging her in. "But right now my concern is you." "Me?" Isabella's voice came out breathless. "I'm not the one who. You're the one they'll come for first." The words hung in the air between them, cold and sharp as a blade. Isabella's mouth went dry. What are you talking about? Dante's jaw tightened. He looked away, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his face, fear. Come with me, he said. He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked toward his office. Isabella's legs felt unsteady, but she followed him, her silk robe trailing behind her. Dante's office was all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books in Italian and English, a massive desk that probably cost more than her childhood home. But it was what waited on that desk that made Isabella's blood turn to ice. Photographs. Dozens of them, spread across the surface like a nightmare made tangible. She stepped closer, her hand flying to her mouth. They were surveillance photos, grainy, taken from a distance but unmistakably her. Coming out of Dante's building. Shopping with her mother last week. Sitting alone in a cafe, completely unaware she was being watched. In every single photo, she'd been circled in red marker. "Oh God," she whispered. But it was the other photos that made her knees weak. Juliana, walking with a stroller through the gardens. The twins, circled in red, their tiny faces visible through the clear plastic rain cover. Who? Isabella couldn't finish the question. The Calabrese family, Dante said, his voice like gravel. My father's old enemies. They've been waiting for me to show weakness. He picked up one of the photos, Isabella getting into a car, laughing at something completely vulnerable. And I gave them exactly what they wanted. What do you mean? Dante's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. You, he said. They know about you. They know what you mean to me. I don't mean anything to you, Isabella said, but even she heard how uncertain she sounded. This is an arrangement. A business deal. Dante moved around the desk, toward her with predatory grace. Is that what you tell yourself? It's the truth. Then why do you watch me when you think I'm not looking? He was close now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. Why does your pulse jump every time I enter a room? Why haven't you run, Isabella, when you've had a dozen opportunities? Because I'm falling for you, she thought. Because somewhere between the fear and the forced proximity, you became something I can't walk away from. But she couldn't say that. Wouldn't. You're arrogant, she whispered instead. I'm observant. Dante reached out, and this time he did touch her. His fingers catching a strand of her dark hair, tucking it behind her ear with devastating gentleness. And I notice everything about you. Isabella's breathing turned shallow. Dante, they're going to come for you, he said, his voice dropping to something almost tender. To hurt me, to force my hand. And when they do, his thumb brushed across her cheek and she trembled. I will burn their entire world to ash. The promise in his words should have terrified her. Instead, it ignited something fierce and wild in her chest. How do you know all this? She asked. These photos were delivered to my office this morning, with a message. What message? Dante's hand fell away from her face, and she immediately missed the warmth. He walked back to the desk, picked up a single piece of paper she hadn't noticed before. When he handed it to her, Isabella's hands shook. The message was simple, typed in neat black letters. You took everything from us. Now we take everything from you. Starting with what you love most. Below it, printed clearly, were 3 names. Isabella Romano, Giuliana Rossi, Marco and Elena Moretti. The twins. They'd even learned the babies' names. They're watching all of us, Isabella breathed. How long have they? Since Giuliana arrived, Dante said grimly. Maybe longer. My security team is investigating how they got this close without detection, but... His hands curled into fists. Someone inside my organization is feeding them information. A traitor. In Dante's own house. Isabella looked at the photos again, at her own face circled in red, at the twins so small and helpless, at Giuliana who was already running from something. What are you going to do? She asked. Dante's expression went cold, the tenderness from moments before replaced by the ruthless Mafia boss everyone feared. I'm going to find who betrayed me, he said quietly. And I'm going to end them. And us. Juliana and the babies and… Isabella swallowed hard. And me. Dante moved toward her again, and this time when he reached for her, he cupped her face in both hands, tilting her head up to meet his dark, burning gaze. You, he said, the word rough and possessive, are mine to protect. They will not touch you. Do you understand? Isabella's heart slammed against her ribs. You can't promise that. Watch me. The intensity in his eyes, the absolute certainty, made her believe him. Made her want to believe him. I'm scared, she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Something softened in Dante's expression. Good, he said. Fear will keep you alive. But know this, Isabella. His thumb brushed across her lower lip and she gasped. I've built an empire on blood and ruthlessness. I've done things that would make you sick. But every terrible thing I've ever done, every cruel decision, every drop of blood on my hands, it all made me into someone who can keep you safe. Even from your own enemies? Especially from them. Isabella wanted to pull away, to think clearly, but she couldn't. Not when he was looking at her like she mattered more than territory or power or revenge. Why? She whispered. Why do you care what happens to me? Dante's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice so low it sent shivers down her spine. Because somewhere between the contracts and the carefully maintained distance, you stopped being a business arrangement and became something I can't afford to lose. Before she could respond, before she could process what those words meant, his phone buzzed sharply on the desk. Dante pulled away, his expression shifting back to cold calculation as he grabbed the phone. Talk, he ordered. Isabella watched his face change, watched his eyes go dark and dangerous. When? He asked quietly. A pause. Secure the perimeter. I'm on my way. He ended the call and looked at Isabella, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. What is it? She asked. They found the traitor, Dante said. And they found something else. What? Dante's voice was deadly calm. Proof that Juliana didn't return on her own. She was sent. The silence in Dante's bedroom felt like something alive, something waiting to strike. Isabella sat on the edge of the massive bed, her fingers twisted in the silk sheets, knuckles white. The room was cold despite its opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen tears, casting fractured light across marble floors and walls lined with dark wood. Everything in this room screamed wealth, power, control. Everything except the man kneeling before her. Dante Moretti, the man who commanded armies with a glance, who made grown men tremble with a word, was on his knees. His hands gripped hers with a desperation that made her chest ache. His perfectly tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger. Vulnerable. Dangerous in an entirely different way. Isabella. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual command. Look at me. She didn't want to. Looking at him made everything harder. Made her heart betray her mind. But she looked anyway. His eyes, those impossibly dark eyes that had watched her with such possessive intensity since the moment he'd brought her into his world, were filled with something she'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of his enemies. Not fear of death. Fear of losing her. Tell me, she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to sound strong. Tell me why she's really here. Why those twins have your eyes. Why you looked at her like you'd seen a ghost. Between them on the silk sheets lay a photograph. Old, creased, the colors slightly faded. A younger Dante, barely more than a boy, really, with his arm around a beautiful dark-haired girl. Both of them smiling. Both of them innocent. Both of them had no idea what was coming. Isabella had found it in his study an hour ago, tucked inside a book of Italian poetry. Hidden but not destroyed. Kept like a wound he wouldn't let heal. Dante's jaw clenched. His grip on her hands tightened, then loosened, as if he was afraid of hurting her even now. That photograph was taken 7 years ago. Before everything. Before I became. He stopped, swallowed hard. Before I became this. Before you became a monster? The words came out sharper than she intended, but she was tired of pretty lies. Tired of half-truths whispered in the dark. Yes. His answer was immediate, unflinching. Before I became a monster. The honesty of it stole her breath. Dante pulled back slightly, releasing one of her hands to run his fingers through his hair. The gesture was so human, so unlike the controlled predator she'd come to know, that it made her heart twist. Juliana was my first love, he said quietly. We grew up together. Our families were allied. Her father was my father's closest advisor. We were supposed to marry, unite our bloodlines, strengthen the family. His laugh was bitter, broken. I actually thought I was lucky. Arranged marriages in our world rarely come with love. I had both. Isabella forced herself to stay still, to listen, even as jealousy coiled through her veins like poison. She had no right to it. She'd known Dante for weeks, not years. Their engagement was strategy, not romance. But her heart didn't care about logic. What happened? She asked, her voice barely audible. Dante's expression darkened. The vulnerability flickered, replaced by something colder. Something lethal. She betrayed us. The words were flat, emotionless. The kind of tone men used when the pain ran too deep for expression. The Volkov family, our greatest rivals, they wanted our territory, our connections, our power. They needed intelligence. Juliana gave it to them. Isabella's stomach dropped. Why? I don't know. Dante's hand clenched into a fist against his thigh. For 3 years, I've asked myself that question. Was it money? Coercion? Did they threaten her? Or did she simply never love me at all? He stood abruptly, turning away from her, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the glittering lights below making him look like a king surveying his kingdom. Or a prisoner staring at his cage. My father discovered the leak, Dante continued, his voice hollow. He confronted Juliana's father first, gave him a chance to explain. To make it right, he pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a mark. They killed him that night, ambushed his car on the way home. 17 bullets. They made sure he suffered. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. Dante. I was 23 years old. He didn't turn around. Couldn't. My father died in my arms in the back of that car. He told me to protect our family, to be stronger than he was, to trust no one. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. He told me love makes you weak. And then he died. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. What happened to Juliana? Isabella asked, though part of her didn't want to know. I went after the Volkovs with everything I had. Dante's voice turned cold, deadly. It took 6 months, but I destroyed them. Every lieutenant, every soldier, every ally. I burned their empire to ash. He finally turned to face her, and the man looking back was the Dante she recognized, ruthless, powerful, merciless. Juliana was with them when we raided their compound. There was an explosion. Fire. I saw her fall. I thought. He stopped, closed his eyes. I thought she was dead. I thought she died knowing I hated her. I mourned her even as I hated myself for mourning her. Isabella stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She moved toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name. When she reached him, she placed her hand gently on his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her palm. But she didn't die, Isabella whispered. No. Dante's hand covered hers, holding it against his heart. She survived, went into hiding, and apparently she was pregnant. With my children. Children I never knew existed. His voice cracked. Twins who have my eyes in her face, and I don't know if I can. He broke off, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. Isabella looked up at him, this complicated, damaged, dangerous man who had somehow become her entire world in a matter of weeks. She saw the monster everyone feared. She saw the son who lost his father. She saw the young man in that photograph who believed in love. Did you ever find out if she was really the traitor? Isabella asked carefully. Dante's eyes darkened. Her father confessed before I killed him. Said she approached the Volkovs herself. Volunteered the information for money. His expression turned bitter. $1 million. That's what my father's life was worth to her. That's what our love was worth. But something in his voice sounded uncertain, like a man repeating a story he'd told himself so many times he could no longer tell truth from trauma. Isabella took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. And you believed him? A man facing death, whose family you were destroying. Dante stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. People confess to anything when they're dying, Isabella continued softly. They lie to protect others. They lie to hurt their enemies one last time. They lie because the truth is too complicated to explain in their final moments. What are you saying? Dante's voice was dangerous now, but not toward her. Toward hope. Toward the possibility that his entire world had been built on a lie. I'm saying maybe you should ask Juliana what really happened. Isabella held his gaze, refusing to look away even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Before you decide whether those children are a blessing or a curse. Before you decide whether she deserves your hatred or your protection. Dante's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. You're too good for this world, Isabella. Too good for me. Maybe. She leaned into his touch despite every instinct screaming at her to run. Or maybe I'm exactly what this world needs. Someone who doesn't belong to it yet. Someone who can still see clearly. His lips curved in the ghost of a smile. And what do you see when you look at me? Isabella's breath caught. The truth sat on her tongue, terrifying and inevitable. I see a man who's been alone for so long he's forgotten what it feels like to be loved without conditions. Without fear. Her hand moved from his chest to his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. I see a man worth staying for. Even if staying might destroy me. The distance between them disappeared. Dante's mouth crashed against hers with the force of 3 years of grief, rage, and desperate longing. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back as he claimed her with a kiss that tasted like confession and condemnation all at once. Isabella kissed him back with equal desperation, her fingers gripping his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed warnings about monsters and blood and the cost of loving a man who lived in darkness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante pressed his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, he whispered against her lips. Tomorrow I'll talk to Juliana. I'll find out the truth. And tonight? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Dante's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest where she could feel his heart racing in time with hers. Tonight, I need you to tell me you're still here. That you're not running. That even knowing everything, knowing what I've done, what I am, you're choosing to stay. Isabella pulled back, just enough to look into his eyes. She thought of the photograph on the bed. The innocent boy who believed in love. The broken man who'd built an empire on vengeance. The father who didn't know he had children until they appeared on his doorstep. I'm staying, she said firmly. But Dante, if we do this, if I stay, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll let me in. All the way. No more secrets. No more walls. Her hand pressed against his chest again, right over his heart. Promise me you'll let me see all of it. The darkness and the light. The monster and the man. Dante stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. Control was everything to him. Vulnerability was death in his world. But slowly, like a fortress yielding after a long siege, he nodded. I promise. And then he kissed her again, softer this time, like a vow. Neither of them heard the soft footsteps in the hallway outside. Neither of them saw the shadow pause at the door. Neither of them knew that Juliana stood there listening, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. Or that she was holding a phone with a message displayed on the screen. You have 24 hours to complete your mission, or the twins die. The safe house smelled like mildew and broken promises. Juliana sat perfectly still in the single wooden chair, her arms wrapped around both sleeping twins pressed against her chest. Marco's tiny fist clutched her shirt. Sophia's breath came in soft, warm puffs against her collarbone. They were the only warm things in this cold, forgotten place. The room was small. Bare walls. A cracked table. A window covered with newspaper that let in harsh strips of blue-gray light from the street lamp outside. The kind of light that made everything look dead. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Her eyes burned as she stared at the burner phone in her trembling hand. The screen was dark, but she knew it would ring again. It always did. On the table in front of her sat a gun she didn't know how to use, a stack of cash she was too afraid to spend, and a note written in block letters that made her stomach turn every time she looked at it. Last warning. She wanted to cry, but she'd run out of tears somewhere between the second threat and the third sleepless night. Now there was only the hollow ache in her chest and the weight of 2 innocent lives depending on her next move. Juliana closed her eyes and pressed her lips to Marco's head, then Sophia's. They smelled like baby soap and safety, a safety that was slipping through her fingers like sand. She had made so many mistakes. 3 years ago she thought she could run. Thought she could disappear into the world and raise these children far away from the violence, the blood, the impossible choices that came with loving a man like Dante Moretti. But you didn't run from people like the Salvatores. You didn't escape the debts your father left behind when he died with a bullet in his skull and your name written in his ledger. She'd been 19 when they first came to her. Young, stupid, in love with a man whose world she didn't fully understand. They told her it was simple. Get close to Dante. Feed them information. Small things. Harmless things. Or they'd kill her mother. So she did. She gave them meeting locations. Security schedules. Names of allies. She told herself it wasn't real betrayal, that Dante was too powerful to be hurt by such small leaks. Until the night his father was murdered. Juliana's throat tightened at the memory. She remembered the way Dante looked at her the next morning, his eyes hollow with grief and rage. She remembered the blood on his shirt, the coldness in his voice when he told her to leave and never come back. He didn't know. He never knew she was the leak. And when the Salvatores told her they were done with her, that her debt was paid, she believed them. She ran, disappeared, found out 2 weeks later that she was pregnant. She thought she was free. But 3 months ago they found her. A knock on her apartment door in Prague. 2 men in expensive suits. And a photograph of her children asleep in their beds. The message was clear. Juliana opened her eyes and looked down at Marco and Sophia. They were so small, so perfect. How could she protect them from monsters when she was barely surviving herself? The burner phone vibrated in her hand. Her heart stopped. She stared at the screen. Unknown number. But she knew exactly who it was. Her thumb hovered over the answer button. Every instinct screamed at her to throw the phone across the room, grab her babies, and run. But where? They'd found her once. They'd find her again. She answered. "You're late," a man's voice said. Cold. Flat. The kind of voice that didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I did what you asked," Juliana whispered, glancing down to make sure the twins were still asleep. "I came back. I went to the estate. Dante knows I'm here." "That's not enough." Her stomach dropped. "You said." "I said get close. You showed up at his gate like a beggar and got yourself locked in a guest room. That's not close, Juliana. That's pathetic." She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. "He has a fiancée now. Isabella. He's not going to just." "I don't care about his little bride," the voice cut in. "You need to get into his office. Into his files. We need the names of his offshore accounts and his contacts in Eastern Europe. You have 72 hours. "I can't." "You can. Or your children disappear." The line went dead. Juliana's hand shook so violently the phone slipped from her grip and clattered onto the table. She pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from screaming, her whole body trembling. Sophia stirred against her chest, letting out a soft whimper. Juliana immediately began rocking, shushing, tears streaming down her face as she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't do this. She couldn't go back into that world, into Dante's life, and destroy him all over again. Not after everything. Not after seeing the way he looked at Isabella, the same way he used to look at her, before she ruined everything. But if she didn't, her babies would die. The thought was a knife twisting in her chest. Juliana looked at the gun on the table. For one desperate, horrible moment she considered it. Considered ending this nightmare the only way she knew how. But then Marco's tiny hand tightened around her finger in his sleep, and the thought shattered. No! She would not let them win. She would not let them take her children's mother away, even if she couldn't give them anything else. She would find another way. Juliana stood slowly, carefully, and carried the twins to the single mattress in the corner. She laid them down side by side, tucking a thin blanket around their bodies. They looked so peaceful, so unaware of the war raging around them. She knelt beside them, smoothing Marco's dark hair back from his forehead. He looked so much like Dante it hurt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of this." She didn't know if she was apologizing to her children or to Dante. Maybe both. Juliana picked up the burner phone and stared at it. 72 hours. 3 days to betray the only man she'd ever loved, or lose the only things that mattered. Her jaw tightened. There was one person who might help her. One person who didn't know the full truth yet, but had every reason to want answers. Isabella. Dante's fiancée was smart. Juliana had seen it in her eyes during their brief, tense encounter at the estate. Isabella wasn't some helpless trophy. She was a woman trying to survive the same world that was swallowing Juliana whole. If she could get Isabella alone, if she could make her understand, maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this that didn't end in blood. Juliana looked back at her sleeping children one more time, then grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair. She had 72 hours, and she was done running. Isabella had learned to recognize the sound of danger in Dante's world. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with sirens or shouts. Danger arrived in silence. In the moment when the guards outside stopped talking, when footsteps fell too carefully in the marble hallway, when the very air seemed to hold its breath. And right now, at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, danger had come to the Moretti estate. She stood frozen in the upstairs corridor, her hand still on the doorknob of the nursery where Juliana had just put the twins down for their nap. Through the crack in the door behind her, Isabella could hear the soft sound of infant breathing, the white noise machine humming its mechanical lullaby, Juliana's quiet footsteps as she moved between the cribs. The other woman had been living in the estate for 5 days now. 5 days since Dante had made the decision that shocked everyone, including Isabella herself. Juliana would stay. Under protection. Under surveillance. But she would stay because those children were his, and Dante Moretti protected what was his with a ferocity that bordered on violence. Isabella had watched him transform in those 5 days. Watched him hold his son and daughter for the first time with hands that had ended lives, his face a complicated map of wonder and terror. Watched him sit outside the nursery at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, unable to stop watching through the doorway to make sure they were still breathing. She had also watched Juliana, broken, grateful, and desperately trying to mother 2 infants while looking over her shoulder every moment. The woman barely ate, barely slept. She flinched at sudden sounds and kept the babies within arm's reach at all times. "They'll come for us," Juliana had whispered to Isabella 2 nights ago, when they'd found themselves alone in the kitchen at midnight. "The Calabrese family. They're not done with me. They'll never be done." Isabella had wanted to offer comfort. Instead, she'd made them both tea and said nothing, because lies weren't kindness. Now, standing in that too quiet hallway, Isabella understood that Juliana had been right. The silence broke with the sound of the front entrance doors opening 2 floors below. Not the usual controlled opening, this was forceful, violent. And then came the voices. 3, maybe 4 men. Not Dante's people. Isabella's heart slammed against her ribs. Dante had left 2 hours ago for a meeting across the city. Most of his inner circle had gone with him. A strategic session about the Calabrese threat, about how to neutralize it before it reached his gates. Too late. She turned and pushed back into the nursery. Juliana looked up from where she stood between the 2 cribs, and their eyes met in an instant of perfect, terrible understanding. "They're here," Isabella said quietly. The color drained from Juliana's face. Oh God, the babies." "Shoo." Isabella crossed to her quickly, gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me. Is there a safe room? A panic room? Anything?" "The master suite," Juliana whispered. "Behind the bookshelf. But it's across the hall, and they're already coming up the stairs. I can hear them." She was right. Heavy footsteps on marble growing closer. Multiple men, moving with purpose. Isabella's mind raced through options with a clarity that surprised her. She'd spent weeks in this house watching, learning, paying attention to things Dante probably didn't realize she noticed. The security patterns, the blind spots, the weapons hidden in furniture throughout the estate. Dante's paranoia turned into insurance, including the gun in the decorative table outside this very door. "Stay with the babies," Isabella said. "Lock this door after me. Don't open it unless you hear Dante's voice." "What are you?" Juliana grabbed her arm. "You can't go out there. You don't understand these men. They'll kill you just for being in the way. Then I'll be in the way long enough for help to arrive." Isabella pulled free gently. "Those are Dante's children. I won't let anyone take them." She didn't wait for Juliana's response. She slipped out of the nursery and heard the lock click behind her. Her hands were shaking as she opened the drawer of the hallway table, felt the cold weight of the pistol Dante kept there. She'd never held a gun before 3 weeks ago. Now she checked the magazine with movements he'd taught her during a late-night conversation about survival. "In my world," he'd said, his hands guiding hers around the grip, "everyone is either a weapon or a target. I need you to be both." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Isabella stepped into the center of the corridor, 20 feet from the nursery door, and raised the weapon with both hands. Her heart was a war drum. Her breath came shallow. But her hands had stopped shaking. 3 men rounded the corner. They wore expensive suits that did nothing to disguise what they were. The one in front had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. All 3 stopped when they saw her. "Wrong floor," Isabella said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Turn around." The scarred man smiled. It was not a kind expression. "Dante Moretti's pretty fiancée. We were hoping we'd find you here too. 2 birds, 1 very profitable stone." "I said turn around." She didn't lower the gun. "You even know how to use that, princess?" The man on the right laughed. "Or is it just for show?" "The safety's off," Isabella said calmly. "The magazine holds 15 rounds. And Dante taught me to aim for center mass because even if my hands shake, I'll still hit something important." The scarred man's smile faded slightly. He took a step forward. Isabella fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed hallway. It went high, intentionally, into the crown molding above their heads. Plaster exploded. All 3 men flinched. "The next one won't miss," Isabella said into the ringing silence. "And before you decide I'm bluffing, ask yourselves if Dante Moretti would let his fiancée live in this house without teaching her how to protect it." For a long moment, no one moved. The scarred man's hand hovered near his jacket. Isabella could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing her nerve against their orders. Then she heard it, the sound she'd been buying time for. Downstairs, the front doors crashed open again. Shouts, movement, and one voice that cut through everything else like a blade. "Isabella!" Dante's roar shook the walls. The 3 men heard it too. Their faces changed, confidence shifting into something else. Something that looked like fear. "You should run," Isabella said quietly. "Before he gets up here." They ran. but not toward the stairs, toward her. The scarred man lunged, trying to grab the gun. Isabella squeezed the trigger on instinct. The shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The other two came at her from both sides. She didn't have time to fire again. Strong hands seized her wrist, twisting the gun from her grip. Another hand grabbed her hair, yanking her backward. She kicked, clawed, felt her nails rake across someone's face. Then the world exploded with violence. Dante came around the corner like divine retribution. Isabella had seen him dangerous before. Had seen him angry. This was something else entirely. This was a man watching someone touch what belonged to him, and the veneer of civilization burning away to ash. He moved with brutal efficiency. The man holding her hair released her so fast she stumbled. Dante caught him by the throat mid-retreat and slammed him into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The second man tried to draw a weapon. Dante's elbow caught him across the jaw with a sound like a bat hitting concrete. More men poured into the hallway behind Dante, his men armed lethal. But Dante didn't need them. He was already standing over the scarred man who'd tried to take Isabella's gun, his foot on the man's wounded shoulder pressing down. The man screamed, "Who sent you?" Dante's voice was barely recognizable. "Give me a name, or I start breaking bones." "Calabrese," the man gasped. "Just following orders. We were supposed to take the woman and the kids. Leverage." Dante pressed harder. "You came into my home. You put your hands on her." Each word was measured. "Lethal. What made you think you'd leave alive?" "Dante." Isabella's voice cut through the haze of his rage. "The twins. Juliana's still in the nursery. They're scared." It was the only thing that could have reached him in that moment. He looked up at her, and Isabella saw the war in his eyes. The need to destroy versus the need to protect. Slowly, he stepped back from the wounded man. "Get them out of my house," he told his men. "I want to know everything. Every order they were given. Every word Calabrese said. And then I want to know where he is right now." His soldiers moved efficiently, hauling the three intruders toward the stairs. Dante crossed to Isabella in 3 strides. His hands cupped her face, tilted her head back so he could search her eyes. "Did they hurt you?" His voice shook. "Isabella, tell me." "I'm fine." She pressed her hands over his, steadying herself against the adrenaline crash that was starting to hit. "I'm fine. They didn't. I stopped them. I bought time." Something shifted in his expression. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like he was recognizing something he hadn't expected to find. "You stopped them," he repeated slowly. "You taught me well. I taught you to survive." "You," he broke off, pulling her against his chest so hard she felt his heart slamming against his ribs. "You stood between them and my children. You could have run. You could have hidden. You stood there with a gun you're terrified of, and you stopped them." Isabella wrapped her arms around his waist, let herself take this one moment of safety before the next crisis hit. Because there would be a next crisis. That was the cost of this world. "They're my family now too," she said into his shirt. "I chose this, Dante. I chose you. All of it. Even this." When he pulled back to look at her again, his eyes were blazing with something more dangerous than rage. Something that looked like reverence. Like possession. Like love in its most violent form. "Then I'm never letting you go," he said. "Whatever comes next, whatever I have to burn down to keep you safe, I'm never letting you go." The nursery door opened behind them. Juliana stood there with a twin in each arm, her face streaked with tears. She looked between Dante and Isabella, and something passed across her expression, grief and gratitude and acceptance all at once. "Thank you," she whispered to Isabella. "Thank you for protecting them." Isabella nodded, because words felt inadequate. She'd crossed a line today. There was no going back to who she'd been before she walked into this house as Dante's strategic fiancée. That woman had been afraid. That woman had been a victim of circumstance. This woman, the one standing in a bullet-marked hallway with blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers, was something else entirely. Dante's hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. "It's time to end this," he said quietly. Calabrese made his move. "Now I make mine." He looked down at Isabella. "And you're going to help me." The gunfire had stopped 20 minutes ago, but Isabella's ears still rang with the echo of it. She stood in the doorway of Dante's study, her hand gripping the frame so hard her knuckles had gone white. The room looked like a war zone. Shattered glass from the floor-to-ceiling windows crunched beneath her feet. The massive mahogany desk had been overturned, papers scattered like fallen leaves across blood-speckled marble. Bullet holes punctured the walls where priceless paintings once hung. And in the center of it all sat Dante Moretti, the most powerful man in the city, reduced to something frighteningly human. He sat on the floor with his back against the ruined desk, his legs stretched out before him, his tailored suit jacket discarded somewhere in the chaos. His white shirt, custom Italian silk that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, was no longer white. Dark spatters of blood painted the fabric in patterns that made Isabella's stomach turn. Not his blood, she reminded herself. The bodies had already been removed by his men, disappearing into the night as efficiently as ghosts. But the cost of that efficiency sat before her, head bowed, powerful shoulders curved inward like a man trying to fold himself small enough to disappear. Isabella's heart cracked at the sight. She moved forward slowly, her heels clicking against broken glass, each step deliberate. She'd learned in the past weeks that approaching Dante in these moments required the same caution as approaching a wounded predator. Not because he would hurt her, but because he might bolt, lock himself behind those impenetrable walls he'd spent a lifetime building. "Dante," she said softly. He didn't look up. His hands, those same hands that had held her with such reverent tenderness just hours ago, now trembled slightly, still stained with evidence of what he'd done. What he'd had to do. Isabella lowered herself to the floor beside him, her designer dress pooling around her like water. She didn't care that the fabric would be ruined, didn't care about the glass, the blood, the destruction. All she cared about was the man beside her who was quietly breaking apart. "You should go upstairs," Dante said, his voice rough, hollow. "You shouldn't see me like this." "Like what?" Isabella reached out, her fingers gentle as they touched his shoulder. She felt him stiffen beneath her touch, every muscle locked tight with restraint. Like a man who just saved everyone he loves? A bitter sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, too broken to be anything but pain. "Is that what you think I did? Saved them?" He finally lifted his head, and Isabella's breath caught at what she saw in his eyes. This was the real Dante Moretti. Not the controlled mafia boss who commanded empires with a look. Not the seductive man who'd slowly stolen her heart with unexpected tenderness. This was the part of him he'd been hiding from her. The darkness, the guilt, the weight of countless violent choices that could never be undone. "I killed 4 men tonight, Isabella." "4?" His voice cracked on the number. "Johnny Russo has a daughter. She's 7. Marco Benedetto just got engaged last month. I know this because I know everything about everyone. That's what I do. I know their lives, their families, and then I—" "Stop." Isabella's hand moved from his shoulder to cup his face, forcing him to look at her. His jaw was rough with stubble beneath her palm, his skin cold despite the warm night air drifting through the broken windows. "They came here to kill you. To take Juliana. To take the twins. You didn't have a choice. There's always a choice." The words came out like a confession. That's the lie men like me tell ourselves to sleep at night. But the truth is, I chose this life. I chose power over peace. I chose fear over love. And now, his eyes searched hers desperately, looking for something, forgiveness, understanding, or perhaps confirmation that she was finally seeing the monster he'd always believed himself to be. "Now you've seen what that choice looks like. What I really am." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment she'd known would come eventually. The moment when the dark romance and dangerous attraction gave way to the brutal reality of who Dante Moretti was and what loving him would cost. She thought of Juliana upstairs, finally safe, holding her sleeping twins close. She thought of the terror in those beautiful babies' eyes when the gunfire started. She thought of the moment Dante had stepped in front of all of them, his body a shield, his voice deadly calm as he'd given the order that ended 4 lives to save theirs. "You want to know what I see?" Isabella's other hand found his, her fingers threading through his despite the blood staining them both now. I see a man who's been told his entire life that strength means never breaking. That power means never feeling. That protection requires becoming a monster. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching his. But you're breaking right now, Dante. You feel everything. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Human. He repeated the word like it was foreign to him. Humans don't do what I've done. Humans don't have a body count that would take hours to name. Humans survive. Isabella's voice was fierce now, her grip on his hand tightening. In whatever way they can, in whatever world they're born into. You didn't create this life, Dante. Your father did. His father did. Generations of men who built this empire on blood and power. You inherited it. And yes, you've made choices within it, terrible, violent choices. But you've also chosen to protect, to shield, to love, even when loving someone meant putting them in danger just by being near them. Dante's eyes closed, his jaw clenching as if her words physically hurt him. When I was 18, he said quietly, my father made me watch as he executed a man who'd betrayed our family. Made me stand there and witness what loyalty cost in our world. Then he handed me the gun and told me it was my turn. That if I wanted to lead someday, I needed to understand that mercy was weakness. His eyes opened, meeting hers with devastating honesty. I pulled that trigger, Isabella. I was 18 years old, terrified, and I pulled it anyway. And do you know what the worst part is? Isabella waited, her heart breaking for the boy he'd been, the man he'd become. It got easier, Dante whispered. Every time after that, it got easier. Until tonight, when I killed 4 men without hesitation, without even a moment of doubt. Because protecting you, protecting Juliana and those babies, nothing else mattered. And that terrifies me more than any enemy ever could. What I'm capable of when I love someone. What I'll do. What I'll become. The vulnerability in his voice stripped away every defense Isabella had. This was why he'd kept his distance for so long, why he'd tried to maintain control even as they grew closer. He wasn't afraid of dying in this world. He was afraid of what he became to survive in it. Afraid that loving her, truly loving her, would turn him into something even darker. Then we're both terrified, Isabella said softly. She brought his bloodied hand to her lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles that made him inhale sharply. Because I'm terrified too. Terrified of how much I love you despite everything. Terrified that love isn't enough to fix what's broken. Terrified that staying means becoming someone I don't recognize. She held his gaze, letting him see every ounce of fear and certainty warring within her. But I'm more terrified of walking away. Of never knowing if we could have built something real in all this darkness. Dante stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. Like the concept of someone choosing him, really choosing him, with full knowledge of what that choice meant, was incomprehensible. Isabella. Her name was a prayer and a warning all at once. If you stay, there's no going back. This life, these choices, they'll stain you too. Change you. And I won't be able to protect you from that. I don't want to be protected from it. Isabella shifted closer, her body pressed against his side now, her head finding his shoulder despite the blood on his shirt. I want to be with you through it. The darkness and the light. The violence and the peace. All of it, Dante. That's what love is. Not just staying for the beautiful parts, but choosing each other even when it's ugly and terrible and costs more than we thought we could pay. His arm came around her finally, pulling her tight against him with a desperation that spoke louder than words. She felt him shaking, this powerful, dangerous man actually trembling as he held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid beneath him. They sat like that in the ruins of his study, 2 people choosing each other in the aftermath of violence, while 3 floors above them, Juliana sat in the nursery holding both twins, her own tears falling silently as she listened to the security feed and made her own impossible choice. Dante's voice broke the silence, rough and raw. I love you. 3 words he'd never said to anyone except Juliana a lifetime ago, before the world had taught him that love in his world meant liability. God help us both, but I love you, Isabella. And I don't know if that's a gift or a curse. Isabella tilted her face up to his, finding his lips in a kiss that tasted like salt and copper and desperate hope. Both, she whispered against his mouth. It's both, and we'll figure out how to survive it together. A sound from the doorway made them both tense. Juliana stood there, still wearing the simple dress from earlier, the twins' baby monitor in her hand. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, but there was something new in her expression, determination maybe, or acceptance. They're asleep, she said quietly, her gaze moving between Dante and Isabella. Finally, she took a breath, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. I'm staying. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Juliana, Dante started, but she cut him off. Not for you. Not for us. There is no us anymore, Dante. We both know that. Her eyes moved to Isabella, and something passed between the two women. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. I'm staying for them. My babies. Because running again means they grow up looking over their shoulders, never knowing security, never having a real home. And because. She swallowed hard. Because despite everything, you'll protect them. Both of you will. They'll have something I never did, a family that fights for them. Isabella felt Dante's grip on her tighten, felt the weight of this new reality settling over all of them. This wasn't the ending any of them had imagined. It was messier, more complicated, more painful. It was also the only path forward that didn't leave someone bleeding. We'll figure it out, Isabella heard herself say, extending one hand toward Juliana, an invitation, a promise. All of us together, whatever that looks like. Juliana stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she crossed the destroyed study and took it, her grip firm despite her tears. She sank down beside them on the glass-strewn floor, three people united not by love or blood, but by the shared understanding that survival in this world required sacrifices none of them had been prepared to make. The Rossi family will retaliate, Juliana said quietly, her practical nature reasserting itself. Johnny was the underboss. They won't let this go. Let them come. Dante's voice was steady now, the vulnerability from moments ago transforming into cold determination. I'm done playing defense. It's time they learned what happens when you threaten my family. My family. The words echoed through Isabella's mind, wrapping around her heart with fierce possession. This was her choice, her future. Beautiful and terrible and more real than anything she'd ever known. Outside, the city glittered with false promises of safety. Inside, three damaged people sat in the ruins of a violent night and chose each other, knowing full well that the cost of that choice would only grow steeper. But in the moment, holding Dante's bloodied hand while Juliana's grip anchored her other side, Isabella felt something she'd never expected to find in the darkness. She felt like she'd finally come home. The study still smelled of smoke and old leather, though the blood had been scrubbed from the marble 3 days ago. Dante sat behind his father's, his desk, staring at documents that would either legitimize the Moretti Empire or destroy everything he'd built. The morning sun cut through the bulletproof windows, casting shadows across contracts his attorneys swore were legal suicide. He'd killed 14 men to get to this moment. 14 men who thought they could use Juliana, use his children, use Isabella as leverage. The pen felt heavier than the gun he'd held that night. You're going to wear a hole in that paper just staring at it. Dante looked up. Isabella stood in the doorway, wearing one of his shirts over leggings, her hair still damp from the shower. She looked younger like this. Softer. Nothing like the woman who'd stood between armed men and 2 innocent children, her voice steady as she'd bought him the seconds he needed to end the threat. He'd never loved her more than in that moment. And he'd never been more terrified. It's not too late, he said quietly. You could still walk away. Take the settlement your father negotiated. Live somewhere clean. Isabella crossed the room with that particular grace she'd developed, the walk of a woman who'd learned to move through dangerous spaces. She perched on the edge of his desk, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. Are you seriously trying to noble sacrifice me again? After everything? She picked up the contract, scanning it. Dante Moretti liquidating assets to establish legitimate holdings. Construction. Real estate. Technology investments. Her eyes met his. You're really doing it. Trying to. He leaned back, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. The old families think I'm weak. Going soft. They're already circling, looking for openings. Then they're idiots. Isabella set the contract down. You just eliminated the Rossi organization in a single night. Weak men don't do that. That's exactly why I have to do this. Dante's voice roughened. I looked into my son's eyes yesterday, Isabella. Really looked. And all I could think was, what kind of man does he see when he looks back? The vulnerability in his admission made her chest ache. This was the Dante the world never saw. The one who'd sat on the floor covered in blood, shaking, while she'd held him and whispered that he was still human. He sees his father, she said simply. Someone strong enough to protect him, and smart enough to know that strength comes in different forms. A soft knock interrupted them. Juliana appeared, moving with the careful quietness of someone still learning she was safe. She held Marco, or was it Matteo? Isabella was still learning to tell them apart, against her shoulder, the baby's tiny hand fisting in her shirt. Sorry to interrupt, Juliana said, but someone's having opinions about his breakfast, and those opinions are loud. Despite everything, Dante smiled. Actually smiled. That's definitely Marco. Matteo's the diplomatic one. Your son is screaming like he's declaring war on pureed pears, Juliana said dryly. Pretty sure they're both yours. The ease between them still surprised Isabella. She'd expected jealousy, possessiveness, the typical drama of the situation. Instead, Juliana had pulled her aside the morning after the attack and said something Isabella would never forget. I loved him when we were children playing at being adults. You love him knowing exactly who he is, including the monster. That's the difference. And those babies deserve to grow up around people brave enough to love honestly. Now, watching Dante reach for his son, God, the concept still seemed surreal. Isabella felt something click into place. This wasn't the family she'd imagined when her father had informed her of the engagement arrangement. It was stranger, more complicated, built on trauma and blood and impossible choices. It was also real. More real than anything she'd ever known. I should feed this tiny terrorist, Juliana said, but she hesitated. The lawyers called. The custody arrangement papers are ready to sign whenever you are. Dante had insisted on legal protection for Juliana, documents that guaranteed her rights as the twins' mother, financial security, a home of her own if she wanted it. He'd also made her an official consultant for his new legitimate businesses, with a salary that made her eyes water. You kept them safe when I didn't even know they existed, he'd told her. That deserves more than my gratitude. It deserves your freedom. I'll come by this afternoon, Juliana said now. She glanced at Isabella, something warm and understanding in her expression. Both of you should come. This affects all of us. After she left, Isabella moved around the desk, turning Dante's chair until he faced her. She stepped between his legs, her hands on his shoulders. Hey, she said softly. You're doing the right thing. Am I? His hands settled on her hips, thumbs stroking absently. Legitimizing the business means showing weakness to people who speak only in violence. It means years of vulnerability while we transition. It means your sons might grow up without having to kill to protect what's theirs. Isabella cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. It means the woman you're going to marry. Are going to marry, he interrupted, his grip tightening. No conditional tense. You promised. Her heart stuttered. Even now, his possessiveness made her breath catch. The woman you're going to marry won't have to watch you leave every night wondering if you'll come back in a body bag. It means we have a chance, Dante. A real one. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against her stomach. For a long moment, he just breathed. She ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the tension slowly leave his shoulders. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Good thing I don't care about what you deserve. She tugged his hair gently until he looked up. I care about what we build. Together. The kiss was soft. Searching. A promise without words. When they finally broke apart, Dante's expression had shifted into something more familiar. The calculating look of a man making strategic decisions. But his eyes, when they met hers, held only warmth. Marry me this weekend. Isabella blinked. What? Not the big wedding. Not yet. But something legal. Something binding. He stood, still holding her. I want you protected under every law that exists. As my wife, you have legal privileges, protections. If something happens, nothing's going to happen. Isabella. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd learned that promises of safety were lies. In my world, there are no guarantees. But I can give you every protection available. I can make sure you're never vulnerable to anyone who might try to use you against me. And selfishly, he traced her jaw with his thumb. I want to know you're mine in every way that matters. She should have felt trapped. Should have felt the walls closing in. Instead, she felt something open up in her chest, a wild, terrifying hope. Small ceremony, she said. Just us, Juliana, the twins, and maybe your consigliere as witness. Done. And I want a real wedding later. When things are stable. With my cousins and a dress that costs more than a car. Whatever you want. He was smiling now, really smiling. Though I'm keeping you in my shirt for this one. I like you like this. Possessive bastard. You're possessive bastard. The moment was interrupted by a wail from down the hall. Matteo joining his brother in what Juliana had started calling the chorus of demands. Dante sighed, but there was something soft in his expression. We should, Isabella corrected, taking his hand. That's the deal, remember? We do this together. They found Juliana in the nursery, looking frazzled but amused as she tried to manage both twins. The room was painted in soft blues and grays, with blackout curtains and enough security measures hidden in the walls to protect a head of state. Because that's what they were, in their world. Royalty. Targets. Survivors. Reinforcements have arrived, Isabella announced, scooping up Matteo. The baby immediately grabbed her hair, fascinated. Though I'm not sure we're qualified. Nobody's qualified, Juliana said, successfully getting a bottle into Marco's mouth. That's parenthood. You just figure it out as you go and hope you don't completely screw them up. Dante stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. His son in Isabella's arms. His other son with Juliana. The three people who'd forced him to become more than the monster his world had created. The family he'd never planned. Never imagined. Never deserved. But would die to protect. Later, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they gathered on the terrace. The same terrace where Dante had once told Isabella she had no choice but to marry him. Where she'd stood, terrified and defiant, and promised herself she'd find a way to survive. She'd done more than survive. She'd transformed. Dante held Marco, the baby's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, and felt something he'd thought died with his father. Hope. Fragile, dangerous hope. Beside him, Isabella cradled Matteo, whispering something soft in Italian that made the baby coo. And slightly apart but part of their circle, Juliana watched the city lights begin to sparkle, her expression peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. We're insane, Juliana said suddenly. You know that, right? This whole situation is completely crazy. Probably, Isabella agreed. But I'm choosing it anyway. Dante looked at her. This woman who'd been forced into his life and had somehow become the center of it. No regrets. Isabella met his eyes, and in them he saw everything they'd survived. Everything they'd become. Everything they still could be. Not even one. As the golden light bathed them in warmth, the city sprawling below like a kingdom of shadows and light, they stood together. Not a perfect family. Not even a conventional one. But theirs. Built in fire and blood and impossible choices. And somehow, despite everything, real. Dante pressed a kiss to Isabella's temple, breathing in the moment. The weight of documents waiting for his signature. The enemies circling in the dark. The long, dangerous road ahead. None of it mattered as much as this. As them. I love you, he said quietly. Words he'd never expected to mean. Isabella smiled, tears catching the sunset. I know. You're stuck with me now. Good, he murmured against her skin. I don't want out. And in that moment, surrounded by broken people choosing to be whole together, Dante Moretti made a silent promise. Not to be perfect. Not to be clean. But to be present. To fight for this strange, beautiful family every single day. Because some things were worth more than power. Some things were worth everything. What do you think about Dante and Isabella's journey? Could you love someone from such a dark world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because their story isn't over yet. There are secrets still buried, enemies still plotting, and a wedding that might just change everything. See you in the next chapter.